appears as though something has happened in the motorcade route. Something, I repeat, has happened in the motorcade route.
The President of the United States is dead.
Considering the number of enemies that he had, Lord knows they had reasons to get rid of him.
And I know that her face is down like this. She pushed him down and crawled out over the back to get a piece of skull off the back of the car.
Turned out that he left his tape recorder going when he left the room.
That bullet then traversed and moved backward. And then you do have the shot from the rear that struck him in the back, and I think there was another shot that hit him in the back of the head.
It didn't make any sense why one guy who suddenly went from having fired a rifle since the Marine Corps and suddenly was able to pull off world-class precision.
Was there a real thread of that fear running through the administration that perhaps a coup could take place?
He and Kenny O'Donnell were told they had to change their stories for the good of the country. He had to basically lie about what he saw.
Showtime. Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and thank you all for joining us. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, or a beverage of choice going. Get in your most comfy chair, settle in, and relax. It is nasty cold out there. It is fall in Canada, and it's a good time to take some time for yourself and just relax. Kick your feet up. We're going to be talking about the JFK assassination. Willow Harlan is a JFK researcher, a 26-year-old college student, all the way from Chicago, folks. And I'm going to ask him very quickly, what got you into the JFK assassination?
It was back in 2013 when I saw a documentary called JFK, The Smoking Gun. That really piqued my interest because prior to then, I had studied and was an admirer of President Kennedy, but I never took an interest in his death specifically until then. I had just accepted the official story before.
Which was that Oswald had shot Kennedy, and is that what you guys were taught in high school? That Oswald, or was it even covered, perhaps, at this late date? You were in high school, what, about 10 years ago? A little under.
Yes. Actually, at the time of the 50th anniversary, I was a freshman in high school. It was covered, yes, but we didn't really go into much detail about it. But prior to then, when I was in elementary and middle school, yes, we were taught that it was Lee Harvey Oswald alone.
Oh, okay. So no dissenting views were ever given.
Nope.
Interesting. Okay, fair enough. Now, one of the things that your expertise is going to come around to is the autopsy machinations that took place behind the scenes. Can we start there? And maybe we can start with Ida Dox's tracing.
Sure. So most of my research into the assassination has revolved around the medical evidence because to me, it's the most important and fascinating aspect, I guess, partly because of the controversy surrounding it, and the head wound specifically has always fascinated me because it was the cause of death. And when I started looking into the case back in 2013, I had seen the autopsy photographs, but it wasn't until a few years ago in 2021 where I started to take a serious, analytical look at them. And it was specifically after I read the book High Treason that I became interested in the very first reactions of the Parkland doctors and nurses' reactions to the picture of the back of Kennedy's head. Because chapter 2 of the book mentions that the late researcher Harry Livingstone had shown Ida Dox's tracing of that picture to some of the doctors long before the actual photographs were published. And he quotes them. And after I read that part of the book, I went about trying to find any record of those interviews. And that led me to the JFK library where those materials are today. And do you want me to go into more detail about that, or?
Sure, sure. Please do. I was going to ask you some questions like, what were your first impressions when you viewed the autopsy photos?
I think, like most people, I was disturbed and shocked by them, but I guess you could say I didn't really I didn't become focus on them specifically until I found out about what the Parkland doctors and nurses had said and what the people at the autopsy had said about Kennedy's wounds and how they conflict with the autopsy photographs. That's when I first became fascinated with it after, oops, sorry.
I was going to ask you, what was it about the Parkland doctors, what they said, and what you viewed that was different?
Specifically, the nature and appearance of Kennedy's head wounds, how, as I'm sure your listeners know, how they described a gaping hole and exit wound in the right backside of Kennedy's head, and how the photographs of the back of his head don't show that. So that's what first made me suspicious of the photographs.
I had Dr. McClelland on the show, and folks, for your information, he's one of the original surgeons that worked on JFK that day, and he stood right over JFK's head, just behind him, and he saw the gaping hole and described it as such. Even I'm going to show a drawing right now of what he sketched and the view he sketched. Now, what's interesting is the sketch that Ida Dox made. Now, show a comparison of that, of the head wound, has it more from the top of the head instead of the back of the head. So there's discrepancies right there. Now, Ida Dox, fair enough, she never saw the body. She wasn't witness to anything that took place at Parkland Hospital November 22nd, 1963. That's where JFK was taken right after he was shot from DEALEY PLAZA. And we can go into that more afterwards if there was more than one shooter. I'd like to get your opinion on that for sure. But right now we're looking at the autopsy photos with Will O'Harlan. Will, you're going to be at the JFK Lancer conference coming up, I understand. And congratulations on that. What is really nice to see is young folks picking up the torch and moving forward with their own investigations, and perhaps everything that you've been taught up into high school and beyond may not be the truth. There's a lot more behind, as you found out, the assassination than what mainstream media is allowing to come out, and the cover-up that goes on to this day. Okay, the autopsies. Now, when Dr. McClelland came on the show, he said that PBS was doing a show back in the 90s, a long time ago. Frontline was doing the show, and they're renowned, very renowned and reputable documentary makers for PBS. And they ushered all the doctors to the archives in Washington, and they had a good look at the autopsy photos. And he said, basically, we were shown a bunch of 8x10. And I'm going to read his direct quote here, folks. Just give me a second. Dr. McClelland, there was a kind of discrepancy in general. The pictures that we saw, they were 8x10 color pictures of the autopsy photos. It showed a large wound in the back of the head. But in one photo, they were, what I thought, pulling a flap of scalp up over the wound, in the back of the head, that is, folks, in order to show a wound in the back of the head, which we had not seen any other wound except this large gaping hole. I was later told by someone that, well, this was not just a flap of scalp being pulled up on the back of the head. This is the way it actually looked. And of course it didn't. And I, well, you know, said to whoever I was talking to, well, that's not the way it looked. This is from the doctor who worked on JFK, folks, and was above his head for over 18 minutes. Because there was a huge hole where that, what I thought was a flap of scalp being pulled up over that hole. So that was sort of the only inconsistent statement in that regard. Well, that's massive. coming from a trained surgeon who worked on the body. He's a first witness person who was there. Many others also said the same thing. I interviewed first person witnesses that were in DEALEY PLAZA. Beverly Oliver saw the back of his head being blown out as well. And then we come back to Ida Dox. I don't think she did anything maliciously, but perhaps she wasn't shown the exact photos that Dr. McClellan was shown. What's your opinion on that, Will?
From what I've learned, it seems like, well, from Ida Dox's testimony to the House Select Committee, she said that she was given access to the original autopsy photographs and just traced over them directly, which, contrary to popular belief, she didn't make freehand drawings based on them. She said she literally traced her drawing directly over the actual photographs, and but not all of them. She only traced 4, to my knowledge, and because officially the committee was not allowed access to the photographs by the Kennedy family, so they just went with her tracings instead, just in their words, out of respect for the Kennedy family and also to avoid the controversy of what the photograph showed. But the disturbing part is that even though they were allowed to see the photographs and had these tracings, they didn't show any of them to the Parkland doctors. So a few months after the committee's report was published, which included Ida Dox's tracings, Harry Livingstone took the report and also 6 Seconds in Dallas, which includes the drawing from Dr. McClelland, and went to Parkland and showed those 2 pictures to several doctors and actually recorded them on tape in secret and just asked them for their thoughts on it. And most of them said, this is not what we saw. And then a year and a half later, in March 1981, 2 reporters from the Boston Globe showed the exact same pictures to several other doctors and nurses, and most of them had the exact same response as the people that Livingstone talked to. And those are important because all those conversations were actually taped, but they were never available to the public until I contacted the JFK Library in an effort to get them so I could confirm or deny what was written in the book.
Let me ask you about that. When you contacted the JFK Library, because I've had several dealings with them, all led to a roadblock, if you will. Don't go down this hole. Did you have much the same response from them? Were they open to you?
Incredibly open, believe it or not. I just asked them, I gave them all the information I learned from the book and simply asked them, is this true? Do you still have these materials? And if so, could I purchase them? And they said, sure. First, they sent me a file with notes, original handwritten and typed notes from both the Boston Globe reporters and Harry Livingstone himself summarizing the interviews. And then a year later, I contacted the audiovisual archivist and asked for the tapes. And she said, we have them and I'll send them to you, but I'm going to have to digitize them first because they had never been digitized before. And after a month, she sent every single one of them to me.
Wow, that's really cooperation. Yeah, I didn't have that type of cooperation. I had made a documentary about Ted Sorensen, JFK speechwriter, folks, and when I contacted the library, oh my. Talk about butting heads. I had met Carolyn at Ted's memorial and told her a nice story about Abraham Bolden when he guarded Carolyn when she was just a little girl. Abraham Bolden, the first African-American Secret Service agent handpicked by JFK. And she was very enthusiastic when I met her at the memorial in New York City. And then she said, well, send me the little video that I had made about it. And I sent it 3 times, never heard back, nothing. So then I was told by people in the community, maybe the JFK Library just doesn't want to look at the assassination. So maybe that's changed now. Maybe the old guard is gone, and I say that word purposely. And the torch has been passed to a new generation, to quote somebody we both know. Now, In your own, did it make you angry to think that you'd been lied to all these years? I mean, now you're a researcher in your own right. You've come full circle, if you will.
Mhm.
What do your friends say when you talk about this?
That's a good question. Usually, they're not very interested, to be frank, but they are surprised that somebody my age knows a lot about it and
Mm.
cares so much. And my family too, because, well, I had always actually taken an interest in history, especially American history from the Civil War to the Kennedy era from the early 60s. History was always my most favorite subject. So I guess you could say it was natural for me to look into this. But about a year or two after I started looking into it, the more disturbed I became by the things that just were never, discussed publicly or in history class, that sort of thing. And it made me sort of start to lose faith in the American media and government, and really affected me psychologically and still does.
How so?
Well, in the sense that nowadays, when it comes to major political crimes or scandals, or just, big nationwide news stories that have such a huge impact, you know, I tend not to, I guess you could say, go with the official or popular verdict, but try to think of it, think about it for myself and rely on primary sources and just try to get to the meat of what the event is, mostly
Critical
by,
thinking. Hmm.
yes, but also trying to rely on, or I should say, not be swayed either way. Because admittedly, that was a mistake I made in the first few years that I looked into this. I blindly went along with several alternative theories that, are kind of absurd looking back on it. So now I try to think for myself and not be influenced on either side.
Would you say your peers, your fellow students, are engaged at all politically at this point, or have they just been so turned off by both parties in the United States that they just feel like it's fruitless?
Really, it's a little bit of both, I guess you would say. There are some of my friends who are very actively engaged, both politically and socially, most of them from the LGBT community.
Mhm.
And then there are some who, like you said, have kind of just given up because, politics is such a, uh, today's today's politics are just, it's so much, it's chaotic and, so divisive. And I think a lot of that division and disagreement stems or was a direct result of the assassination,
Agreed.
which I'm not the first person to suggest that, but
Yeah.
I've kind of noticed that pattern over the years.
I grew up with Dr. King. To paraphrase Dr. King, he said, I want my kids to be judged on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Now I see quite the opposite happening. There's so many opportunities that are being left out of people because of their skin color, their gender choices. It shouldn't be. It just shouldn't be. Everybody should be equal. And this is what we were fighting for all the way through. And I think perhaps that might be one of the reasons why JFK was assassinated and Dr. King and also Bobby just after that. Your feelings on where the country is headed now, the United States. Good place, bad place?
Good question. Truthfully, I think really time will tell. I wouldn't necessarily say, good or bad. The future is kind of unpredictable, but I think there are a lot of issues that need to be talked out rather than debated or fought over, because that's one of the many problems I see with today's political climate, whether that's on social media or in person. It feels like almost nobody can agree, but I feel like, if we start to first of all acknowledge that we have serious problems, then I think we can start to fix them together. But I don't really have a definitive answer, to be honest.
No, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. Let's go back to the autopsy room.
Sure.
What were some of the other things that came to the forefront for you and said, hey, this doesn't quite fit in the mix?
Well, for the autopsy, mainly, I think it was the secrecy and, you know, kind of off limits, kind of hush hush nature of the whole thing because of the fact that, it was technically an illegal autopsy since it, as we know, it wasn't done in Texas. And the fact that, it was in a controlled military environment where everybody in attendance, wasn't, I guess you could say, the most qualified for a homicide or a forensic kind of investigation. So I think that's where a lot of the questions and controversies stem from, plus the fact that a lot of them were forced into secrecy and were not allowed to talk about it for years. But also the conflicts between not just Kennedy's wounds, which is my main area of interest, but also, the condition or appearance of his body when it arrived versus at Parkland, and the things that were and weren't looked at or done, like the bullet fragments, whether or not the wounds were properly traced and that sort of thing, military control and interference with the scope of the autopsy and all that. It really disturbed me and is what led me to focus specifically on that, especially after I read Best Evidence, which really shocked and disturbed me. And I know you've talked with David Lifton a couple of times.
Yeah, we
So he's
just did a
probably talked
show
about that.
for a couple of days ago. We did a show called Ode to David Lifton.
Mhm.
And you're number 151 of my guests that have been on the show that have referenced his book, by the way.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's how important that book has been. Now, I want to ask you, when I look back on ancient history, and I know this is ancient history for you, it's many, many years ago. And I look back at famous presidents, and I think of Lincoln. Obviously, I think of Lincoln. He's a great leader. FDR is another one. What is it for you? I think when I think of JFK, I think of hope. How do you feel about JFK as an historical figure?
I think hope definitely would be a good word to describe him. Excuse me. But for me, I suppose it would be his idealism and his, I suppose, unconventional approach to govern, and how his policies and ideas were very much against the norm and mainstream for the time. And it's sad because I think that had he lived and been reelected, I think he had a lot of potential to change things. And even early on, he had started to, like, his emphasis and passion for space exploration in the Peace Corps, and especially for me, his very rigid uh, anti-aggression and anti-war stance. As you probably talked with Ted Sorensen about how his adamant refusal to invade Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis and how that led him to really butt heads with the CIA and Joint Chiefs of Staff. I think he was very much, arguably, more courageous than a lot of people give him credit for, and how I feel like a lot of presidents before and since didn't really have that kind of courage to I guess you could say, stand up to the establishment and go with their guts, really.
You're very insightful. Very insightful.
Thanks.
And you've much impressed me because one of the things I mentioned to Ted, I said, I think what brought you and Mr. Kennedy together is idealism. And that's the word that you used. And that's very insightful. Well, I'm going to ask you a question because this show is syndicated throughout the university networks here in Canada, all the universities, all the community radio stations, as well across the internet. As you know, it's on YouTube, and there's several other television stations in Canada that pick this show up as well. That's why I dressed up today, folks. And this is a poppy for my American viewers. This represents November 11th, which is Veterans Day in the United States. This is so we remember that those who came before us, there's a reason why we have this beautiful, safe country, both above the border and below the border. It's because of our vets, and we have to remember them and their sacrifices. And the yellow one is for the Israeli hostages. Bring them home and bring them home now. Now, this next question I ask every guest who comes on the show. After I've said that you're speaking literally to every university student across the countries, what would you say to them?
I would say mostly I would encourage them to really take a long, hard look at history, whether that's Canadian history or American history, and really try to learn from it. I know that some people might sound cliche with the saying, study the past or you're doomed to repeat it. But the way I view history is, I think the more we reference it and pay attention to it, the more we can start to take those lessons that history has given us and what we've learned from it and apply it to the future to make sure that, our countries or our societies prosper, I guess might be the best way to say it.
I think that's perfect. It's a good way to wrap it up. For me, history, folks, has always been if you're 16 years old, you're out in your car and suddenly you have an accident. Who are you going to call? You're going to call your parents right away because chances are they've been through the same thing. That's a template in history. And then you learn how to do that and you pass it on and pass it on. So you're able to make the correct decisions at the correct time based on your own knowledge. And you look back, that's why we read books, to find out and make better critical decisions in the future. Will O'Halloran has been our guest tonight, folks. He is a JFK researcher, and the future looks bright. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Brent Holland from The Brent Holland Show. See you all next time.